Hello to ant colony optimization. The goal over the next 30 minutes is to provide a brief overview on the inspiration for and the basic operating principles of the ant colony optimization metaheuristic. What is ant colony optimization? It was first introduced by Marco Dorigo in 1992 as part of his Ph.D. thesis, and it was originally called the ant system. According to Dorigo's ACO website, ant colony optimization studies artificial systems that take inspiration from the behavior of real ant colonies, and which are used to solve discrete optimization problems. The best place to start learning about ant colony optimization is perhaps unsurprisingly with real ants. Ants have limited individual capabilities. They have rudimentary sight. In fact, a number of species of ants are completely blind. They have limited visual and auditory communication. They're not capable of achieving complex tasks on their own. However, they are incapable of extremely impressive group results. And this is without any governing control. They can build elaborate nests and defend those nests against large predators. They can regulate the internal temperature of their nests to within 1 degree Celsius. They can form living bridges. They can cooperatively carry very large items. And they can efficiently sort food. And last but not least, they forage for food sources. And this last point is the one that we're going to focus on today. And that's because in the foraging for food, emerges a type of natural optimization, wherein you are trying to balance the food that you're gathering against the energy that you're expending to get that food. And this leads to the creation of the shortest path between the nest and the food source. So what is the secret of this impressively complex behavior from these relatively simple individual agents? The key to this impressive behavior is stigmergy. This is a term that was coined by a French biologist by the name of Pierre-Paul Gros in 1959. And he originally used it to describe termite behavior. You can see a termite mound on the right side of the screen. Termite mounds in Africa and tropical climates can grow up to 30 feet tall. And the individuals, or termites, that build this one only interact with each other through modifications of their environment. So stigmergy is a form of self-organization, and it can produce complex, purposeful structures and behaviors without the need for planning or direct communication between the agents involved. There's actually a number of corollaries to this behavior in humans as well. One of the most significant is Wikipedia. In Wikipedia, articles start with the germ of an idea, which one person will put up, and this germ will be picked up kind of like a mud ball in a termite mound and carried forward by a number of other individuals who are not corresponding with the source of the original idea. And this can produce very large and complicated works. Wikipedia is 60 times larger than the next largest encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it's also roughly as accurate according to a peer-reviewed study by the journal Nature. So how do ants take advantage of stigmergic behavior? Well, ants are capable of producing chemicals, and these chemicals are known as pheromones. The social behavior of ants is largely driven by the trail pheromone. And trail pheromones are pheromones that they can use to mark a path on the ground that other ants can follow. These trail pheromones are deposited while they're walking to and from food sources. So what are the big takeaways so far? ants will choose to follow trails with a higher pheromone level, with a higher probability than trails with lower pheromone levels. So, given the choice between two trails, they're more likely to choose the trail that has higher pheromone. As more ants use a path, the pheromone trail goes stronger. And this results in something very important. This results in autocatalytic behavior. So as more ants follow the trail becomes increasingly attractive. And this creates a positive feedback loop. And these points are the core inspiration for ant colony optimization. In order to get a better understanding of how ants use stigmergic behavior, we're going to take a look at the double bridge experiment. This was an investigation of pheromone trail laying and trail following behavior. Now, the species studied in this experiment were the Acumulus, this was done in 1989, and the Lasius niger, which was done in 1997. This is a photograph of the trail setup, showing the short and long trails, and we'll get more into that in a second. The general assumptions for the calculations going forward will be that all of the ants are traveling at roughly the same speed, all of the ants are depositing an equal amount of pheromone on the ground, and that they add this pheromone in both their forward and backward steps, so in their trips to the food sources and then back to the nest. So the first phase of the double bridge experiment involves two branches of equal length, connecting the nest and the food source. So ants enter the trail, and we're going to assume that the ant speed in this case is 7.5 centimeters per second. So it's a pretty fast ant, but it makes the math work out a little cleaner. So the ants arrive at point A at time 0 seconds. When they get to point A, they have a 50% probability of going in the direction of B1 and a 50% probability of going in the direction of B2. So we're going to assume that these two ants diverge at this point. And since they're traveling at the same speed, top ant will reach B1 at the same time that the bottom ant reaches B2. Continuing on, time t equals 4 seconds, they're going to reach point C. And this over the entire trail so far, they'll have been depositing trail pheromone. They've reached the food source. They can head back towards the nest with their food. And when they get to this fork in the road, because there's equal amounts of trail pheromone laid on the top part of the trail and on the bottom part of the trail, they have a 50-50 chance of selecting which path to go back. And so we'll assume that they split again and arrive back at the nest. Over time, due to random fluctuations, one of the paths will end up building up a slightly higher level of pheromone. Just like if you were to flip a coin, over time you're going to hit a stretch of tails or a stretch of heads. But in this case, when you hit that stretch, it is a positive feedback loop and it will build on each other. The slight edge that one trail has will draw more ants to that trail, and the more ants that come to it will lay down more pheromone, and it'll become stronger and stronger over time. So this plot shows results from the double bridge experiment, where each branch of the bridge has an equal length. The plot clearly shows that over time, the traffic on one of those branches is either going to be very close to 0, very close to 100. And it's going to be either close to 0 or close to 100, the probability of very close to 50%. Moving on to the slightly more interesting case of the double bridge experiment. In this modification, one of the branches is now twice as long as the original branch. So again, ants enter in from the nest, and they reach point A at time t equals 0. Once again, there is no pheromone on the ground, so they have a 50-50 chance of selecting which way they're going to go. And we will again assume that they branch off. But now, at time t equals 4 seconds, one of the ants has already reached the food, and the other ant is only halfway down the path. And just as before, they have been laying down trail pheromones the entire way. So the ant that's already grabbed the food is going to grab it and continue on back. And he's going to get to this point C for the second time now, before the first ant has reached it for the first time. Because he's getting there before the next ant has had a chance to get there, there's going to be pheromones on only one of the paths. And so now it's not going to be 50-50. Now it's going to be closer to 70-30. And so while it is still a probabilistic approach, the odds are much greater that it's going to go towards the shorter path. And we'll show that is happening. So now the second ant has had time, and it's got to the food, and it goes back to point C. And now we can see that because the first ant used the top path twice, even though his trail is marked from his path along the longer trail, it is now still biased in the short path direction. While the odds aren't quite as good, you're still dominant in favor of the top path. So we'll show him going back along the more biased route. You can see that he has added his own level of trail of pheromones onto that top route, further preferencing it for future ants who come along. And over time, and rather quickly, that top trail will become the dominant trail for the ants. This chart summarizes the results from a number of experiments within the double bridge experiment when one of the paths is twice as long as the other path. And it's clear from this plot that in the vast majority of experiments, in excess of 80% of the traffic converged on the short branch. Before we move on from our investigation of real ants, there's one more topic that should be addressed, and that's the limitation of this behavior in nature. So this slide is titled Opportunity Missed. So we're going to go back to that same double bridge experiment from previously with the long branch. But this time the short branch is not connected. So the ants enter from the nest, and they travel to the food, and over this time they are strengthening the pheromone trail on this long path. They don't have another path to take, so if they want to get to the food, they have to keep going down this path. And every time they pass it, pheromone trail gets stronger. And after a period of time, the short branch is reopened to them. But because they are probabilistically driven to go towards the path with the higher pheromone trail, or higher pheromone levels, they are likely going to ignore the shorter path. In fact, even when an ant does choose to take the shorter path and reaches the food, in all likelihood, they will not take it again, because every time they pass by the opportunities to take one or the other, the probability of taking the short path is going to be much, much lower than that of the long path. And this is borne out from the results of over a large number of experiments with adding the short branch. In this case, it was added after 30 minutes. So you can see that the percentage of traffic on the short branch really doesn't get very much higher than about 20 to 40%, and even that's only over 40% of experiments. And in the majority of experiments, it doesn't get higher than 20% of traffic. So, while ants can adapt to obstacles being thrown in their way, and they can move around those obstacles, they're not good at taking advantage of a faster path when it opens up after a dominant trail has been established. So this leads us to the creation of a stochastic model for the ant colony. And this is proposed by Dunenberg in 1990 and Goosen in 1989. And they describe the dynamics of the ant colony. Specifically, they relate the probability of choosing the short path when starting at a given point I. This is the equation, and it is, as mentioned, the probability of starting at point I and choosing the short path at a specific point in time. And just some nomenclature for the above equation. The point I is an element of either A or C, so that's the point at the beginning or the end of the double bridge, the point near the nest or the point near the food. TS is simply the time it takes to traverse the shortest path. So that's the length of the path divided by the speed of the ants. And then phi of T is the total amount of pheromone on the branch. And we're going to consider that to be just proportional to the number of ants that have passed over that branch. So some notes on this model. The value of alpha that's shown in that previous equation is an experimentally derived value, and it's taken to be equal to 2 based on the efforts to make the model correlate with real experiments. No pheromone evaporation is considered in this model because the timeline of convergence for this ant behavior is much shorter than the amount of time required for the pheromone to begin to evaporate. And in order for this to work, as was shown in some of those demonstrations, it's necessary for the ants to deposit pheromone both on their way to the food and on their way back from the food. Otherwise, without depositing pheromone in both legs, this model will not converge. So let's go through a quick example using the stochastic model. And for this example, we'll go back to the late addition short path, just to show how hard it is for them to overcome a dominant path once it's established. So let's assume that the time that the short path is added is t equals 30 seconds, and that 4 ants have already used the long path to both collect food and return from the nest. In other words, they've gone there and they've come back. So the number of ants that have gone over the longer path will be 8. And the number of ants that will have gone over the shorter path will be 0. It wasn't available before, and so there'll be no pheromone on that trail. What is the probability that the next ant to arrive at point A is going to choose the short path? So you can see that the time it takes to traverse the short path is simply the distance of the short path, and that's 30 centimeters, divided by the speed of our pretty fast ant, 7.5 centimeters per second, and that's 4 seconds. So the probability that the ant at point A takes the short path at t equals 30 seconds is going to be 4 plus 0, so since the short path hasn't been used, divided again by that same 4 plus 0 squared, plus 4 plus 8, which is the phi value for the long path. And you can see that the odds of it taking the short path, even after just 4 ants have gone back and forth from food, is only 10%. And so this model converges rather quickly, and it is difficult to take advantage of new opportunities like a suddenly emerging short path. So what are our goals for artificial ants? Well, we want to solve more complicated problems than a simple bridge. And ultimately, we're not looking to do what was just done in that previous stochastic model, which was they were creating a model for real ant behavior, and that's not the goal here. What we're looking to do is exploit the elements of ant stigmergic activities, which can be so powerful, and create a heuristic that allows us to solve much more difficult problems. And we need them to be more flexible in regards to a changing environment, so that they take advantage of that shorter path when it's presented to them. So now let's transition from looking at real ants to artificial ones, and study some of the basic mechanisms of a simple ant colony optimizer to better understand how ACO exploits the concepts of autocatalytic behavior and stigmergy. So let's begin by discussing the problem with applying pheromones during the forward-seeking loops. As we discussed, real ants apply pheromones on the trip to and from the food source. In fact, this is necessary behavior to ensure convergence. However, when dealing with more complicated paths, this can lead to problems. Specifically, ants can become trapped in loops that they create. So we imagine an ant setting off on this advanced double bridge, and if it gets caught in a loop, as it circles around the loop, applying pheromone, the loop will become increasingly attractive. And the more it circles around the loop, the more attractive the loop becomes. And even if it's lucky enough, as was the ant in this small animation, to escape the loop, subsequent ants are likely to become trapped. And again, by circling around, the loop becomes more attractive. The real problem with this is that the shortest path is no longer the most attractive path. Now the most attractive path is this circuitous loop. So how are we going to tackle those loops that our artificial ants are capable of making? Well, the way that's employed is to give the individual ants a limited memory. This allows them to record their trip to their destination. And once they reach their destination, they can scan back over their trip and eliminate loops that were created. And they do this by scanning over the nodes that they've passed over. If they passed over a node more than once, they can eliminate the block in between those repeat nodes. So they'll retrace their steps on the return trip, and they'll ignore the pheromone trail on the way back to the nest. And because they will be retracing their steps on the way back, that is the only time when they'll be applying pheromones to the ground. They will not apply pheromones on the forward trip because that can lead to that positive loop. So we can think of two working modes for our artificial ants. And the first is this forward searching ant. And so once it's on a node, it'll probabilistically choose the next node, and it'll do that based on the amount of pheromone on the next node. While it's moving in the forward direction towards its goal, it is not depositing pheromone. The second mode is backward, and that's moving from the food source or from the goal back to the nest, or back to the starting position. And that's when the solution is constructed. So prior to starting back towards the nest, as mentioned, it's going to implement loop elimination. And then it'll retrace its own steps using its memory back to the nest. And only during this retracing step will it start to leave pheromones on the ground. The probabilistic path searching behavior of our artificial ant in forward mode is driven by the following equation. And this equation is based on a static connected graph G, and similar to the graph shown at the left side of the screen, where there are n nodes, and these nodes are connected by a set A of undirected arcs. So the probability of transitioning from node I to node J assuming that you are ant K, is then directly related to the ratio of the pheromone on the path between I and J divided by the sum of the pheromones between node I and all of the neighboring nodes, with excluding the node that your ant just previously occupied. Alpha in this equation has been found to produce better results when it is equal to 1, as opposed to an alpha value of 2, which was found to better mimic the experimental results in the stochastic equation for the bridge problem. So another way of improving our artificial ants' performance over their real-life counterpoint is with proportional pheromone application. So the amount of pheromone that's laid down on the return trip is equivalent to the quality of that solution. So the shorter the path, the more pheromone that gets laid down on that return trip. And there are actually some correlations for this among real ant populations. So there are some species of ants where the ant that finds the richest food actually lays down a thicker pheromone trail. And the way that this is employed is that at the end of the iteration, a delta tau for that ant is laid down on the nodes that it has visited. And it is equal to 1 divided by the length of its trip. And using this method can significantly reduce the number of artificial ants that are required to converge to the best solution. Now I wanted to touch on the importance of what I'm calling the Robert Frost ant. So Robert Frost's famous quote, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. That has made all the difference. The exploration of different paths is extremely important to the search process. And in part, this exploration is achieved just by the stochastic nature of the forward search routine. So an ant is not always going to go in the direction of where the most ants have gone before it. There are going to be those Robert Frost ants, the ones that see the well-traveled path and still take the less likely choice. But there's no good way to ensure, just based on that alone, that if that Robert Frost ant finds a better solution, that gets promoted within the group. And the way that that's done in these artificial ants is an accelerated evaporation of the pheromone trail. And this is a key exploration mechanism. So this does occur in real ant trails, but it's too slow to play an important role. And by accelerating it, we can promote continuous improvement. So if an ant takes the less popular path and finds a path that is a better solution, then by promoting evaporation, we can be quicker to forget errors from past iterations, and we can move past poor quality solutions in favor of better options. And the way that this is applied is that after each ant K has moved on to its next node, the global pheromone trail is updated, and it's updated by evaporating the existing pheromone on all of the arcs, according to the formula shown here. And in that equation, rho is just a parameter that relates to the rate of evaporation. So as you increase rho, you can expect faster evaporation. And because you're doing this after every iteration, this becomes an exponential process. So as a summary for this section, let's step through a simple ant colony optimization algorithm. The first step will be to initialize all of the arcs with a uniform pheromone level. Next, ants will be randomly placed across the grid. These ants will progress towards their goal by probabilistically selecting their subsequent nodes. And this node selection is based on the relative pheromone level of the surrounding nodes. Once the goal is reached, loops in the path that was just traced are eliminated by searching through the sequence of nodes. The ant then retraces its steps. The global trail can then be updated by evaporating a portion according to the parameter row. An amount of pheromone, delta Tk, is then applied to the retraced arcs, and delta Tk is equal to the inverse of the length of the path that ant K took. This can then either be looped again, or the routine can be exited. Finally, some closing thoughts. The main characteristics of the ant colonization optimization are that it takes its inspiration from a natural process. It is a stochastic searching routine, and it takes advantage of positive feedback loops, principles of stick merging.